So about a year ago, I published a video saying French politics is broken and about to get worse. And oh boy, did it get worse this week. So if you haven't seen that video yet, the link is down below. I'd say about 90% of it is still current and relevant, but if you don't have time to watch it, I'll try to keep this video accessible. In case you haven't heard, the far right had quite the day last weekend in the EU elections, and that's especially true in France, where the far right party, the National Rally, trounced everyone else, most of all the center-right party of President Emmanuel Macron. For context, these are the EU elections for the 7 main parties. We'll refer back to this a few times. So the RN, the National Rally, is the biggest winner in the entire EU in Sunday's election, while Macron's party is one of the biggest losers. And Macron responded to this historic shellacking by dissolving the National Assembly, France's lower house of parliament, and calling for snap elections in less than a month, which is causing absolute chaos on the political landscape. So since I won't have time to put together a proper deep dive until after the election, I figured I'd put together a quick update on what the hell is happening. I don't even know what the situation is going to be like by the time I publish this video, so I'm going to try to focus on aspects that will stay relevant until the election, but I'll probably do more updates in shorts. That's not what I mean. So just to be clear, legislative elections are local elections for the 577 seats in the National Assembly. So there's 577 asses on the line, plus Macron's entire cabinet of ministers, but Macron's ass isn't one of them. This isn't a snap presidential election. There isn't supposed to be another presidential election until 2027. So what happens if Macron's party loses, meaning a different party gets the most seats in the assembly? That would trigger something called cohabitation, where the president is essentially forced to appoint a prime minister from that party. Now, France is a semi-presidential system. They do have a prime minister as head of government, but the French president is one of the most powerful presidential offices of any democracy on earth after the US. But that's only the case when the president's party has a majority of parliament. In cases of cohabitation, the prime minister takes the front seat, and the president's role becomes largely ceremonial. So a Prime Minister Marine Le Pen, or anyone else from that party, would mean they're in charge of the country. So what the hell was he thinking, dissolving the National Assembly and possibly handing the reins of power to the National Rally? He didn't have to do that. There was nothing in the EU elections forcing him to give up his majority in parliament. But we're starting to have a slightly clearer idea of what might have been on his mind. First of all, the timeline for these elections is shockingly short. It's so short that the people who hadn't already registered for the EU elections can't register for these elections. The deadline is already passed. And EU elections consistently have the lowest turnout of any French election. This time around, only half of eligible voters cast a ballot. And the plan can't possibly have been to take the National Rally by surprise and not give them the time to prepare for another election. They just ran a clearly incredibly successful campaign for the EU election, and their campaign engine is still revving. All they have to do is keep it going for another 3 weeks. The people this timeline hurts the most is the left. In my last video, I told you about a grand coalition of all parties on the left called NUPES, formed shortly after Macron's re-election in 2022. That coalition collapsed a year ago, and the left has been atomized by infighting ever since. And it seems like that was the goal, because the 3-week campaign left zero time for the left to get their shit together and unite under a common platform. If you follow US politics, you might have heard about how the Democratic Party has been funding the primary campaigns of extremist Republican candidates because they think they will be easier to beat than moderates in a general election. Well, France doesn't have the US's insane campaign finance system, so that can't happen as explicitly here, but it's not too far from what Macron seems to have been doing. He spent his entire presidency outside of campaign seasons demonizing the left while normalizing the far right. Like when his interior minister called Marine Le Pen soft during a debate in 2021, or when Macron himself rebuked his prime minister for reminding people of the National Rally's historical roots in the Nazi collaborationist Vichy regime, saying essentially that rather than resorting to name-calling and history lessons, the RN should be fought on the merits of their ideas, like a normal party. Which, fine, but as soon as it's time to campaign, his messaging switches to how we need to defeat the far right.
Editing stand here. So I didn't take time to address it in this video, mostly because we've already talked about it in the previous one, but yes, the National Rally is a far-right party. That's not a matter of opinion. And you don't have to trust me on this. The French State Council, which is their Supreme Court, officially ruled on it. It is a settled matter.
He props them up because he thinks they'll be easier to beat than the left. Because Macron seems to believe that the only reason the National Rally was gaining ground was immigration. And if only he could take that issue and make it his own, like with a big immigration reform or with laws targeting how Muslim girls can dress in schools, that would take the wind out of their sails. And he's not the only centrist to be trying this approach in Europe, and it's failing. Now, don't get me wrong, immigration is a big issue, but it's one of many, and the undercurrent is people are angry. And when you ask them why, they're angry about not having a doctor in their small town, or hospitals closing down, or the age of retirement going up, unemployment benefits becoming harder to get, prescription drugs not being fully covered by Social Security. solidarity, and a whole host of other issues, many of which can be directly attributed to spending cuts enacted by Macron and his predecessors. And there's reasons to be skeptical of leftist proposals on these issues. One, because every time they were in power, the economy either took a dive or they governed in a similar way to the right. It's almost like it's easier to be in the opposition than to rule. And two, because there are legitimate reasons to be worried about the economy, and Macron boasts about his record on fiscal responsibility and unemployment. But while the richest in France have been doing extremely well under Macron, with France's 42 billionaires increasing their combined net worth by 230 billion euros since 2020, the bottom 90% of French people saw their combined net worth decrease during the same period. And the number of people resorting to food banks has skyrocketed. It's almost like unemployment isn't the best measure of whether people are struggling, which is why the Yellow Vest movement was so big. And the National Rally doesn't have a response to this. All they've ever done is run in opposition to the ruling parties and blame immigration for all of these issues. You're poor because we're giving too much money to foreigners, they say. And to be clear, they were against Macron's pension reform when everyone was in the streets, but now Jordan Bardella, their new leader and Marine Le Pen's successor, just said they wouldn't reverse it after all if they're in power.
It's worth noting gender politics also plays a role in the rise of the far right, with reactionaries galvanized against the Me Too movement and trans rights, which they see as le wokisme being imported from US college campuses.
So I put together this video as quickly as I could, and I didn't have time to do the fieldwork that I would like to do for a project like this, other than filming one protest before I had to travel home. Right now, I'm trying to figure out if I can afford to go back to Paris at the end of the month to cover the election. And the month of July, with the possible inauguration of France's first far-right prime minister since World War II on the backdrop of the Olympics, stuff's gonna happen. So if you want to help me cover that in person, the best way you can do that is by supporting me on Patreon. I also just opened a coffee page as another option, so the links are down below. And I have plenty of projects that are just too ambitious for the channel as it is now. One of them would involve me being on the field for 2 to 3 months, much of it off the grid, and I need to make sure that I can pay my rent while I'm gone. So any support is greatly appreciated, but if you can't afford to, that's totally fine too. Leave a like and comments, tell me what I'm missing or what I got wrong, and if you hit the like and share button, that already helps a lot. So thanks, and back to the video. The EU election results triggered massive anti-far-right protests in France, and against all odds and even the wildest hopes of the most fervent leftists, parties on the left did unite within 48 hours of the Assembly's dissolution. And to explain why that was so unlikely, we need to talk about this guy, Raphael Glucksmann. He's been an MEP since 2019, founded the center-left party Place Publique, and led the joint campaign between Place Publique and the Social Democratic PS party in the EU elections. And PS, which used to be a ruling party, had nearly disappeared in the last few years. But with Glucksmann's help, they surged past the more radical LFI party in the EU elections, in large part because LFI, and specifically its leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is quite divisive even among leftists, many of whom were hungry for a less radical alternative. So in comes Glucksmann, who's emerged as a darling of the media and the frontman for the resurgence of the PS, with the main campaign message being in opposition to LFI. And he's even getting praised on right-wing news channels, while very few people are talking about his time as a political advisor to the authoritarian Georgian president Mikhail Saakashvili, while Saakashvili was accused of violently repressing protest and overseeing the mass torture of prisoners. Anyway, Glucksmann has become quite influential in the center-left and a very pro-institution politician who hates the LFI. Last time round, it took months to hammer out a deal to form NUPES, and this time, initially, Glucksmann ruled out any agreement with LFI. But after quick negotiations, he agreed on conditions including support for the EU, support for Ukraine, and a commitment to less combative politics, less violent rhetoric, if you will, along with the shared goals of reversing some of Macron's policies. And what this agreement means is that they will run only joint candidates in the election under the banner Popular Front. But it's still early days, and we have to see if the Popular Front lasts until the election. Meanwhile, right-wing parties, with the exception of the National Rally, have gone to hell in a handbasket. The Republican Party, the party of de Gaulle and Chirac and Sarkozy that completely collapsed in the last couple of elections and has been inching into far-right territory ever since, their president, Eric Ciotti, announced, apparently without consulting anyone else in the party, that he wanted an alliance with the National Rally.
I actually interviewed this guy a couple of times back when I was a baby reporter in the south of France over 10 years ago, and there's nothing surprising about this. He's been itching to work with the far right for decades.
But the Republican Party still has a moderate wing, and they responded by kicking him out. However, he still claims to be the party's president and has support from some members of the party. Their Facebook page published a condemnation of Ciotti's firing, while their Twitter account, right after announcing the firing, was temporarily taken down.
And after I recorded this, a court reversed Ciotti's firing from the Republicans.
Complete mayhem. And to the National Rally's right, you have Eric Zemmour. When Marine Le Pen started to de-demonize her party, that left a little bit of a vacuum on the far-right fringe of French politics, where Zemmour created his party, Reconquest, and attacked Le Pen from the right, calling her a sellout and a leftist. And the executive vice president of the party is Le Pen's niece, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, who now just goes by Marion Maréchal. She was just elected as an MEP for Reconquest on Sunday, and this week she also tried to broker a deal with the National Rally. But when that fell apart, Zemmour fired her along with 3 other of the party's MEPs. Out of 5 members of the European Parliament elected less than a week ago, Zemmour fired 4 of them. Not because he doesn't want an alliance, he really desperately does. He's just really upset that they weren't able to get a deal. But the chaos on the right doesn't seem to be hurting the National Rally, and the first polls to come out ahead of the snap elections look incredible for them. They might actually end up doing even better than in the EU elections, which would be unprecedented. Historically, the National Rally overperforms in the EU elections. But we're well into unprecedented territory at this point. So in the initial polls, they were getting 35%, now it's down to 31 again, and the left, now that they've assembled as the Popular Front, are a close second at 28%, with Macron's coalition a distant third at 18. To be clear, this is a simplified chart. There's smaller parties here, here, and here, but I'm trying to keep things digestible. Ever since the 2002 presidential election, there's been a tradition of sorts in French politics. That was the first year the National Rally, then called the National Front, made it to the runoff election. And every party, from far left to conservative right, banded together against the far right to preserve democracy. They call it the Republican Front. And ever since, it's been working less and less. Now, it's completely out the window. Right after the left announced the Popular Front, Macron held a press conference where he seemed more angry at that than at the National Rally's results. He's furious at Glucksmann for agreeing to the alliance, labeling the other parties extremists on par with the far right. And to be clear, the left doesn't want to work with Macron either, but now we know that the Republican Front was never a measure to stop the far right. It was only a measure to help the center right. Now that the left is the best chance to stop the far right, it's out of the question. So the Republican Front used to be all parties left of this line banding together. Now Macron refers only to his centrist coalition as the Republican Bloc. In his mind, nobody to his right or his left is pro-democracy anymore. So in setting a 3-week election deadline, Macron only helped the National Rally. He ruled out even the possibility of motivating unregistered voters because they can't register in time. The only upside to the dates he chose was maybe preventing a leftist alliance, and the only conclusion I can draw from that is that he doesn't intend to win this election. If he wanted to win, he would have left enough time for more voters to register. And if he sacrificed that possibility to sabotage the left, what that tells us is that he would rather have a far-right prime minister than one who represents the broader left. This is a president who's been promising to stop the far-right's rise to power. Many experts are saying that what he seems to believe is the National Rally in charge of the government for 2 years would be so terrible for the country that it would hurt their chances in the 2027 presidential elections. And there's an idea in French politics that France is ungovernable, that any ruling party, no matter how popular, their approval rating collapses as soon as they take office. And if that is indeed what he's betting on, the chips he's using for that bet are the people who would be most affected by a far-right government. And in the best case scenario, that's who he's throwing under the bus for the next 2 years. Thanks a lot for watching. If you're not new to the channel, you'll probably have noticed that I haven't published a proper YouTube video in a while. And I've been working on plenty of things in the background. I have 2 projects that are like 90% done, so they'll be coming out in the next few weeks. And I really appreciate everyone who's supported me in the meantime, especially those who kept their Patreon subscriptions. Thank you so much. Again, leave a like and comment, and you can follow Barely Informed on Instagram and TikTok at @barelyinfo. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.